So be the great and wide sea abo, wherein are things creeping innumerable, both small and great beasts. There to the ships, and there be that Leviathan whom thou hast made to take his pastime therein. These wait all upon thee, that thou mayest give them meat in due season. The Book of Common Praise sail, Hui, the British whale ship Jezebel, came alive. Everyman on board forsook his various chores and rushed anxiously to the bulwarks to gaze out over the deep, blue expanse off water. The first mate promptly informed his superior, Captain Seabury, who emerged from his cabin to join his crew topside. Adjusting a brass spyglass to his eye, he summarily gave the order to alter course, and soon the English frigate was tacking toward the small speck on the skyline roughly 3 leagues distant. Undoubtedly a similar pattern of thought played through the minds of mariners who watched as thastily closed the distance between the two vessels. It had thus far been a rather disheartening voyage. From London across the Atlantic, by now virtually depleted of the sperm, was a long and tiresome journey in itself. Southward, the once bountiful Brazil grounds offered few sightings and little encouragement. On past the chill, barren Falkland Islands, they struggled around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. Though summer in those latitudes, the ship battled its way through tremendous head seas and skirted frightful fields of Antarctic ice, enduring howling gales for almost 3 weeks, as nights and days merged into gray sameness. Once having gained the Pacific to the west, they spotted, gave chase, and killed 2 baleen whales near the island of Masafuro, several hundred miles off the coast of Chile, but one of them sank before it could be properly hitched and was lost. So the men aboard the Jezebel, understandably, were impatient to reap the rewards of their hardship. A whaleman's life was necessarily shaped by loneliness and exhilaration, tedium and terror, always voracious for nature's bounty, if could persevere to secure it, for was well aware of how sorely the odds were against him, and in favor of his adversary. Admittedly, last year was a very profitable one for Pacific whaling. Yet with scarcely 600 barrels of oil in the hold, no one need be reminded that scores of ships in the past, for whatever reasons, had returned home freighting barely enough cargo to pay expenses. Hence, they were keen to have a customary gam, or visit, with this passing vessel, hopefully a sister whaler, and learn what favorable prospects might lie waiting in the vast and trackless sea ahead. As the Jezebel neared the other ship, they saw that it was indeed a whaler about 100 feet long, of approximately 370 tons, and although was square, rigged except for the mizzenmast, all but the light sails had been reefed, as if already hove to for the night. Whalers were seldom underway in darkness, except when traveling between whaling grounds or trailing a wounded whale, but it was scarcely late afternoon. Closer still, and it was observed that the ship seemed somewhat neglected. The entire hull was encrusted with barnacles, and it looked a bit ragged overall. From the way it rode in the water, listing slightly to starboard, it gave the impression of being either fully laden in bulk or else had sprung a leak. But what was most peculiar disconcerting, in fact, was that there was absolutely no movement or sign of life on deck. Whereupon someone noticed the pennants flying at 3 mastheads signal for help. They maneuvered alongside the other ship, identified by the lettering on its stem as the Reaper, and lines were thrown across and made fast. At first, the possibility of a plague was debated, and the consequences of close contact between ships. However, the captain theorized this was probably not the case, nevertheless restricting anybody from boarding the vessel unless expressly authorized. He squinted to the west. It shall be dark in an hour or so. He mumbled to himself, then to the boatswain, back the maintop's, and proceed to snug her for the night. Mr. Cribb, the first mate, a swarthy, broad-shouldered chap, appeared at his side. "Aye, sir. Pick 2 of the decides to accompany us," he instructed. "We must board her and investigate ere nightfall takes us." The others were mustered, and the informal party clambered on board the Reaper. The ship was cloaked in an eerie hush. Only a vagrant, light breeze periodically set the shrouds to moaning softly, Captain Seabury turned to the others. "One of you men have a thorough look, see topside, another search the forecastle. Mr. Cribb, you explore the contents off the hold, and I shall locate the captain's quarters." They nodded and separated accordingly. Below decks, it was even more oppressively deserted than above. The narrow companion-way led directly to the captain's cabin, and Captain Seabury descended into a deepening gloom. Once in the cabin, he called out to the crowded shadows, "Ahoy, anyone about?" There was no answer, save the dull, choppy gurgle of the sea as it washed along the outer hull off the ship. In the semi-darkness, he tripped over a chair on his way to the captain's desk, but there found a scrimshaw lantern and lit the candle nub within. Aided by the dim light, he eased next into the captain's head, empty, and the captain's stateroom, which was not. On the berth reposed the form of a body, covered completely by a blanket that appeared to be riddled with holes and blotched with dark stains, which he quickly recognized as dried blood. A discharged pistol lay on the floor beside the bed. Something thin and white protruded from the edge off the blanket. All eyes were abruptly averted upward. "Where away?" someone bellowed. The lookout, seated precariously on his perch in the crosstrees 100 feet above the rolling sea, pointed one hand to the horizon, cupping his mouth with the other. A bark by the look-offer, he sang out, "All down about 4 points forward the starboard beam." Captain Seabury reached down and jerked off the blanket, his stomach clenched. It was a human skeleton, still clothed in only a tatter of rags, and one of the hands held a Bible to its chest. A conspicuous hole in the side of the skull indicated a suicide. Unwilling to tarry, Captain Seabury pushed on to the first and second mate's cabins, which were both unoccupied, but in the former discovered the ship's logbook. This, he knew, should divulge at least some hint as to what had occurred aboard this mystery ship. The book was open to the final entry, date just 2 days ago. He was going to scan it there and then, but a sudden noise close by caught his attention, and he wheeled around, listening. Yet now there was nothing, only continued silence. Deciding to wait until later to peruse the journal at length, he rummaged the pantry. There he found ample reserves of smoked meat, salt fish hard, baked rye bread, beans and rice, and other foodstuffs, as well as kegs of cider and grog. No, it was not starvation that had doomed the men off the Reaper. In the steerage, the captain discovered a second body sprawled out near the foot of the companionway ladder, this one a skeleton also. A small oil lamp was shattered beneath it, leaving a lightly charred spot. Evidently the person had been carrying the lamp and stumbled or fallen upon it with his chest, the flame quickly smothering under his weight. "Captain, where ye be?" he heard the first mate calling. "Mr. Cribb emerged from the doorway off the blubber room. When he espied Captain Seabury hovering over the skeletal remains, he nodded in acknowledgment. I saw it as I came down. Another off men met them and joined in, pointing a thumb behind him. I found 3 of his mates in the forecastle, nothing but bones just like him." The trio stood speechless a moment, contemplating the macabre figure at their feet. Then Mr. Cribb broke the spell. "Sir, I've been to the hole. I think you'd best take a peek." They followed him down the hatchway, into the stinking, stifling hold, black as that of a slave ship. In the wavering shadows they stepped carefully, for the stairs and gangways were more often than not slick with oil and scum and could be hazardous. The captain lifted his light high and saw no need for explanation as to Cribb's discovery. The hold was crammed to capacity with whale oil, no less than 500 barrels. The first mate drew his master's attention to the alarming level of water which covered the ballast and almost all of the bottom rows of barrels. "It's more than bilge water, sir. See how the frames are unusually damp. I believe she's been slowly talon on water. Shipworms, I'd be a guessin'." Just then they all heard a distinct scraping, rustling sort of sound, coming from several pools of darkness beyond the candle's feeble, flickering glow. The third man glanced over his shoulder. "I eared queer noises myself," he whispered uneasily when I was forward. "And I, too," added Cribb. The captain frowned but kept his sedate demeanor. "Rats, most likely, though 'tis odd they have not vacated this part off the ship, considering the seepage." It was a common fact that rats flourished on such vessels, attracted by whale oil and blood. But somehow that reassurance did not put their minds at ease. Captain Seabury smacked his lips in dismissal. Well, let us be off. The rest of the crew will begin to wonder for our safety. Once on deck, the fourth sailor reported to the captain. The blokes must have a bane try. Ain't out a whale, sir, but everything seems to be in a bit of a rur's nest, like they just up and quit. The cuttin' platform is still in place, and the try-pots is full. Anything else? The man nodded quizzically. Aye, 3 of the boats is missin'. The other 2 Ave Bane deliberately scuttled avin the spare. It was true. The remaining whaleboats hung from their davits, all rendered useless by a vandal's axe. Twilight had by now deepened into dusk, a starry but moonless night. Back on board the Jezebel, Mr. Cribb took Captain Seabury aside for a private conversation. What do you suppose, sir? Abandoned a slowly sinking ship. Mutiny. The captain creased his brow and thought. She's of Yankee origin, probably making for home, but a whole cruciden lied certing in 3 whaleboats on the open sea. They would fare a much better chance staying with her till the end, pressing her as far as possible toward the nearest landfall, and mutiny, while they've a full hold, more yet. What of those sad skeletons? Surely 'tis a queer business, but perhaps this will furnish the key. He tapped the log. Cribb seemed restless. By your leave, sir. He continued, you know me not to be a hen-hearted man, but something about this gives me the willies. I, for one, would sleep better this night if that ship were cast off and kept at a wide berth, at least until we can puzzle it out. The captain shook his head slowly and clutched the other's shoulder. His voice was resolute. I respect your concern, my friend, but I feel 'tis unwarranted to that extent. I must also respect the best interests of the owners of this vessel, and the sole purpose of her voyage. Begad, man, are you aware of what oil is fetching per ton back in London town? Do you not realize the treasure we have yonder? There is a fortune in her hold, and by all the laws off salvage that drifting derelict belongs to me. 'Tis the good hand of Providence. The first mate was still not satisfied, but, sir, many of the men are superstitious. There will be talk and scuttle, but they'll fancy her a Jonah. The captain began to grow impatient. Then tell them not. Set the first dog, watch, and be sure no one gets curious and boards her. At the crack of dawn we start shipping her cargo. The first mate sighed in resignation. Aye, captain, I will see to it. Captain Seabury watched him go, and relished one last long look at the swarthy, sinister hulk of the reaper. Then he went below. After a supper off cracker hash, prune pie, and tea to wash it down, he met with the other officers to outline plans for the morrow's task of loading the considerable quantity of oil. Shortly before midnight, at 7 bells, he returned to his quarters, lit a lamp, and poured himself a tot offrun. Filling his pipe, he settled comfortably into a chair and opened the leather-bound book to a place dating 9 days prior where, strangely enough, he noticed, the handwriting changed altogether. The heading at the beginning of these newer entries, written in a refined, precise hand, pronounced at the top, Ship the Reaper of New Bedford, in the South Pacific Ocean, June 1846. Bearings, reckonings, and other specifics were noted respectively. The daily accounts, however, were exceptionally long, more than a few pages in length. Then he realized this segment off the journal had actually been backdated, as if to catch up several days' neglected entries. The Jezebel creaked and rocked Lazarito the Whim off the sea. So there, in the solemn tranquility off his cabin, Captain Seabury started to read, and a most bizarre tale began to unfold. The weather had held nicely, being fair but very hot. We were homeward bound at last after 40 arduous months at sea, plowing the deep and farming its green pastures, and it had been a plentiful harvest indeed, with our hold quite full. Thus the prospect of still one more whale was rather looked upon as a cup running over. Way into the afternoon the cry was sounded, "There bluos!" Our lookout having glimpsed the familiar 10 to 12 foot spray off air and moisture from the animal's blowhole, visible for up to 2 miles, without delay the boatswain began supervising miscellaneous jobs on the deck, in anticipation of the kill. In jig time 3 of the slim whaleboats had been Launched into the water, Sioux men to a boat, myself included, and we commenced rowing in the direction of the sighting. The boats were soon scudding across the wavelets, our second mate calling softly, "Spring on your oars, me hearties." Spring hard, I tell you. As we approached, he ordered the oars shipped and paddles brought out, which were quieter, for though a whale's vision and smell are poor, its hearing is acute. A flock of petrels skimmed the water in wide circles, eager to peck at whatever marine life might be clinging to the whale's back. Had the beast itself been feeding, or had it been spooked? If feeding, it would reappear in the general vicinity within 30 minutes or so. Otherwise, it could swim for 10 miles or better before resurfacing for air. Silent and tense with expectancy, we could simply wait and watch, floating like a cork on the immensity of the ocean, the sea and sky vague, warm reflections. We did not have long to wait. All at once there was a yell from one of the boats, "He breaches." As the surface erupted hereabout, the whale surging out off sea in a Maritime lap, it white, watered with a deafening sound and again submerged, but not before the mate could make a reasonable guess at how far the animal would travel underwater, judging from the way its flukes were turned. It was fairly sizable sperm, 65 feet at least, strangely mottled black and gray in color. He was an old ill-tempered bull, apparently, aware of her presence and somewhat agitated as well. Once more we were pulling on our oars. The harpooner stood at the ready and braced himself against the clumsy cleat, harpoon in hand. It was a 6-foot shaft connected to a 30-inch iron rod tipped with a razor-edged double flue barb. During idle periods on ship, these fellows incessantly checked their gear, recoiling lines, sharpening and resharpening harpoon and lance points, and the time off, their preparation was at hand. The men in the other rowboats positioned themselves also. Suddenly, 20 feet away, there was a tumultuous crash as the whale surfaced square lie beneath the first mate's boat, cleaving it in twain and toppling some of the crew into the frothy, foaming water. Others clung perilously to the wreckage or lay trapped amidst the tangle of cordage. Then it dipped forward, twice smashing its broad flukes down on the floundering men and flotsam with such force as to splinter the remnants like so much kindling, sending spray into our own boat. There was only one survivor, whom the other boat managed to reach. The whale, obviously enraged, continued to rampage nearby, as if already in pain or fear. Our companion boat attempted to sink a harpoon, but one off, lines snagged as the thrashing brute moved off a short distance and abruptly sounded, carrying the boat down therewith and drowning all but 2 off men, our captain being one off latter. When Thuhale resurfaced, we were close by near enough to him, and dietly put wood to blackskin. The harpoon flashed straight down into the thick blubber and sang clear to its socket. The island offals trembled for a moment with shock. Then the harpooner snatched up a second harpoon, this one tied to an inflated bladder, which would tire the animal should it try to dive again, and was able to drive it to the hilt right beside the first one. He tossed out 100 feet off, half-inch Manila, quickly but carefully. Harpooner took over the steering oar while the second mate exchanged positions at the bow, and nary a second too soon, for now the harpoon line was whipping out of the boat. The wounded whale was off, the 2 harpoons buried in its flesh. Wrapped around the snubbing post, the line became taut, and the prow dipped into the water till there were only a few inches off freeboard. The second mate glanced back apprehensively and shouted, "You look out what you are about. Do not box the boat down too much, you may flip her." The line whirred faster round the loggerhead until it started to smoke from the friction, so the nearest oarsman dipped water onto it, hatchet handy should it be necessary to cut the rope. Our quarry was running briskly but erratically, dragging us behind it at no less than 12 knots the Nantucket sleigh ride. Then, with a certain horror, we realized that the behemoth was bearing down on the Reaper. Recollections off told tales went racing through our minds. The legendary depredations and malign intelligence of such solitary rogues as Mocha Dick, New Zealand Tom, and Timor Jack. Our ship could, in all likelihood, fall victim to its own prey, and at the present we were helpless. Our fears began to materialize. The whale was obviously coming foul of the ship, as if to stave in her hull. At the crucial instant of impact, He slowed and swerved, grazing the vessel's keel with the side off its gigantic head and body, and shearing a way part off, the hull's copper sheathing as he went along, and came to leeward, but by the life office it appeared the Leviathan had no ill intent upon the ship as such, but was merely finding some sort of relief in scraping its hide against her broadside. Yet the danger was in no ways past, for as the whale of a sudden nudged sharply amidships, an astonished sailor engrossed in the excitement leaned too far over the rail and was knocked off balance, plunging headlong over the side. The poor devil fell in front of the monster and was swept directly into the creature's great jaw, where the 8-inch long teeth of the powerful bottom jaw clamped shut, crunching his hapless victim to pulp. It happened almost within the blinking of an eye. With fresh advance, we took hold of the line and rounded in slack, cautiously moving in for the coup de grace. Although tiring quickly in close quarters, the beast could still crush us like an eggshell. Once within range, the second mate unsheathed one of his lances, an 11-foot spear with steel oval blade, and aimed for the vulnerable area behind the right flipper at approximately eye level. This was the life of the whale, whither the animal's massive arteries converged near its heart and lungs. With quick dexterity and skill, the lance was given its critical, killing thrust, striking home and slicing with terrible efficiency through the windpipe. Thereupon the whale's lungs were flooded, and the supply of blood to the heart dwindled. Stem all, our mate called again, and we backed the boat off to a safe distance. The whale, briefly submerged, surfaced and spouted a pinkish red mist. "We have him now," someone exclaimed. "See his chimney afire." The death throes did not last long. After about 5 minutes, he rolled dead on his side. The crew wasted no time in lowering the slender scaffolds of the cutting in stage over the whale, and we pitched in to insert a chain through a slit cut in the flukes, which were swung forward. Thither it was brought alongside, floating just awash. Having joined our shipmates on deck, we surveyed the inboards for damage, and found none other than the external layer of copper plating, designed to retard marine growth. By then, it was rapidly nearing sunset. Luckily, we were spared a grueling tow to the ship. The whale was ours, but woe the cost, for the sea was haunted with the ghosts of and offer men. The dying rays of the setting sun turned the blood-stained sea into a dark, shimmering rainbow of fire. Before supper, our master or old man, as we referred to him among ourselves, proffered a prayer in memory of our dead mates. It was admittedly a harsh, dangerous, and often violent livelihood. He said, this existence on the unforgiving sea, long and far from family and friends. But whalemen were a proud and stubborn lot, and pointed out that it was better for an old salt to be lost at sea, caught up in the adventure that was his life, than to languish on land and perhaps pass away in a wretched sick bed in some dismal, shuttered room. And for most of us his words rang true. The old man was in his late 30s or thereabouts, his face rugged yet aristocratic, and sporting an elegant beard. He had signed aboard in his early teens as a lowly cabin boy, and gradually worked his way aft to the officers' quarters. Whilst we weary oarsmen stole a few hours of sleep that night, our other crewmen finished arranging the equipment for the next 2 or 3 days' labor, processing dead whale and rendering it into barrels of oil. The cumbrous iron kettles were uncovered and cleaned, kindling laid under them for when the blubber was ready to be boiled, and water was poured in the brick trough on the floor beneath the try-works, to protect the wooden deck against the extreme temperatures. In the early morning we were rousted into action. All hands ahoy! Tumble up and man the windlass. Nothing but arses and elbows this day, mateys. So we each fell to our tasks with a will. We would toil around the clock in 6-hour shifts amid an inferno of soot and flame, transforming the Reaper into a miniature floating factory. Upon closer inspection, we soon ascertained that the whale was as peculiar physically as in its previous behavior toward the ship. It was not mottled in color at all as we had originally perceived, but was partially covered with literally thousands of barnacles. Old battle scars, calluses, sucker, fish, sea lice, and barnacles were a common sight on just about any whale, but to this degree was most extraordinary. Colonies of such crustacea were generally referred to by whalemen as dead men's fingers, either owing to the stalked, finger-like appearance in which they typically grew, or because of their rigid, death-like grip. At any rate, even though our former wind had lessened to a light breeze, the ship carried only enough canvas to maintain slight headway, to retard the vessel from drifting in circles, and so the gentle forward motion would act to hold the heavy carcass in close to her hull. The 20-foot cutting spades were taken from their racks, and several of the men set to flensing away huge blanket pieces of the foot-thick, yellowish mantle of fat under the moderately thin outer skin, to be impaled with a hook and hauled on board. The old man and second mate kept a vigilant eye on everything, ensuring that we sliced the blubber to the proper thickness, churned the cauldrons habitually to prevent any settling on the bottom, and making sure the blazing, sputtering fires were kept fueled to the highest intensity. If anyone was caught shirking in his duties, he received a good dressing down. Show, a leg there, buckos, this ain't no widow's walk. No regular meals were served, but rather we would take an occasional break for a smoke and snack off blubber cracklins and biscuits dipped in salt water and fried in the oil, or fritters of minced whale meat mixed with potatoes. The great number of barnacles proved to be a significant hindrance, oft-times making it nigh impossible to chop into or through them, thereby frustrating our efforts to easily or practically get much off blubber we sought, and repeatedly causing it to tear as it was stripped. The whale was rolled over on its back, and the mates wielded their spades with surgical precision to sever the lower jawbone, providing ivory from its colossal teeth. They managed to slash the massive vertebrae and decapitate the beast, employing block and tackle to raise the giant head to deck level near the gangway, so one of the hands could carefully dip out of the natural reservoir therein, containing hundreds of gallons of spermaceti, a fine oil highly esteemed by New England candle makers. It was not until afternoon when I noticed that the mutilated whale had attracted marauding sharks, as usual, but for some very strange reason, they were hesitant to approach the carcass too closely, as if they were instinctively frightened off something. It was most puzzling, yet this was not nearly so mysterious as what occurred late that night, when 3 of our men were killed in a singularly horrible manner. The work progressed throughout the night, and bison up dense clouds of smoke still veiled the rigging, the decks gleaming darkly with blood and grease, enormous masses of blubber scattered here and there. Oil hissed and sizzled in the trypots, and the entire ship was enveloped in a cloying stench. During the night, the listless breeze had virtually died away altogether, the sails scarcely off the masts, and left us stranded in a dead calm. Sometime before noonday, I was below decks assisting 2 other men in placing casks of cooled oil into stowage. We were working toward the bow, wrestling them to fill every nook and cranny. The hold was a confining, gloomy place, imprisoning odd odors and shadows. Suddenly one of mates accidentally happened upon something behind several displaced barrels in an obscure cummer, and his eyes nearly popped out of his head. Stretched out in grotesque fashion were the corpses of 3 of our erstwhile shipmates, unmissed from an earlier shift. They had been ravaged beyond belief, barely recognizable for the men Theons were. One of my comrades tore his eyes from the sickening sight and peered intently into the deeper darkness. "Listen," he muttered, "you hear something." I hearkened closely and probed the shadows for some sound or movement, but there was nothing stirring. Anxious to get shy off these shuddersome surroundings, we forthwith notified the old man, who summoned everyone out except for the second mate. After much serious discussion and conjecture, he had the sailmaker sew up the bodies, or what was left off them, in some spare canvas, and with quick, quiet ceremony conferred them to the ever-present sharks. When evening came, the Reaper drowsed sluggishly in the water, her mast tops towering toward the stars, the sea as black as basalt and smooth as glass. Only an occasional flying fish broke the surface, swiftly gliding off into the night as if in fear. Perhaps they sensed our own. About an hour before sunrise, myself and a number of others were awakened by a fearful howl from the second mate's cabin. He came lurching out, barefoot and clad only in trousers, holding one hand away from him with his other, and then we discerned that there was something round attached to the whole back part of his hand. Blood dribbled freely betwixt his fingers and slowly ran down his arm. Was in my bunk. He stammered, his throat tight with fear, and I 'spect my arm was hanging out, touching the floor. I woke up feeling an awful pricklin' and found this thing on me. We examined the object carefully. Every now and again it quivered slightly, as if securing itself more firmly in the mate's hand. After several moments it struck us as to why the thing seemed somewhat familiar. It was one-off the barnacles that thronged our dead whale, but barnacles these obviously were not. Just what they truly were, we had yet to learn. The organism had plainly embedded itself in the second mate's flesh. We endeavored to pull or pry it off, but the man winced and cried out in pain, unable to endure it. Various other opinions and suggestions were bandied about and tried in due course, such as applying heat to its shell, which prompted it only to dig deeper, yet none of these methods proved the least bit effective. Finally, the old man took aside the chippy and spoke for his ears only. Momentarily, he returned and gravely informed our second mate that it appeared the only solution to be quit of the creature, and to keep him from slowly bleeding to death was to amputate his hand. This may have seemed a rather drastic measure, but as a result of our vain attempts to remove the thing, and the victim's increasing torment and revulsion, the mate reluctantly agreed. We plied him with the old man's stoutest rum, and ere long he lapsed into a deep, drunken stupor. For as much as we boasted no surgeon or formal doctor on board, the task was left to the butchery of the ship's cooper. Carpenter. When the deed was done, the laceration was cauterized with a red, hot iron till the bleeding stopped, so it could be cleaned and dressed. He was carried back to his quarters to sleep it off. The hand, still with its parasite, was then dropped into a burlap bag and placed in one-off pots of bubbling oil for a long while. When the creature was dead, the sack was discarded and the hand carved away until only the creature remained. We huddled round and studied it in detail. It was comparatively small, that is, in relation to the others we had noticed on the whale, ranging in size from a man's fist to a large dinner plate, and semi-spherical in shape. It reminded me of a horseshoe crab without its tail. The shell was rough and incredibly resilient, thicker and tougher than a tortoise shell. Someone tried to cut it with a short mincing knife and could not. This chitinous mantle was strengthened by a lower 1/2-inch band of movable, shelly plates, probably its means of locomotion a ring of rubbery cartilage from which sprouted sparse, stubby growths off bristle or hair, mayhap some sort of sensory apparatus. Despite the dense and rigid carapace of the creature, it was remarkably light in weight. The underside mouth parts of the animal functioned as a piercing organ, and our scrutiny disclosed a narrow but deep slit running lengthwise, which housed several rows of sharp, serrated teeth. Surrounding it was moist, leathery tissue with what looked to be cement glands, and dozens often needle-like claws, each tipped with barbs. On this particular specimen, these could be extended as much as 5 centimeters and were unquestionably the source of its tenacious clinging and boring abilities. With a skitter off goose flesh, we surmised that this surely explained the presumed rubbing motions of the whale against our hull, having been driven mad with pain. I dare say the longer we pondered the dark possibilities of this, the more it seemed plausible. The sperm is primarily a deep-water dweller. Its predilection for giant squid, some 400 pounds and measuring 5 and 50 feet in length, lured them down more than 1/2 mile to feed, their awesome underteeth enabling them to dislodge the squid from their rocky lairs at the bottom of the sea. Even other whales, such as the slender gray, were known to have surfaced after foraging with their heads and lips besmeared with a murky ooze from the inky depths below. The faint sunlight would give way to utter blackness, and in the unfathomed realm of an eternal night, who could guess what alien creatures lurked therein? There were all manner of sea-floor scavengers, parasites, and such-like, weird carnivores, primitive snails, and other curiosities. The intestines of any whale might be teeming with as many as 20 different kinds of pelagic worms. So it was not improbable at all, then, that our stricken whale had perchance been made host by these odious denizens of deep, conceivable like wandering through a nest of ticks or fleas. In light of thy's revelation, and having stripped the whale offal, we could, in spite of its myriad barnacles, we unchained the remains of our hard-earned prize and cast the carcass adrift. But with a trickle of terror, we realized the tardiness of this action, for by this time the majority of the creatures had left the dead animal and were now firmly fastened to the bare wood of the vessel's starboard hull. a large portion of the protective copper sheathing having been torn off by the whale. When another nightfall approached, an atmosphere of dread descended over the sullen ship like a funeral shroud. The somber gray of dawn brought with it the discovery of 2 more of our men, both half-eaten. It was appalling. One off crew members found them together on deck under the midship shelter. It occurred to us that it was strange that 5 offer companions had met this gruesome end, and yet no one heard an outcry or sounds off struggle. This happenstance led us to suspect that the unfortunate wretches were suddenly swarmed and helplessly covered with the creatures, or else perhaps some of the things possessed the capability to poison or stun their victims, possibly depending on their size or the area of the body whereto they affixed themselves. Or, as in the case of the second mate, they were clearly advantaged by his heavy slumber. Similarly, scuttling armies of cockroaches, some as much as 1.5 inches long, frequently nibbled around the lips and beards of exhausted, sleeping sailors in quest of food residues. It was an exceedingly unpleasant speculation. We gained disposed of corpses, then the old man had us swab down the decks with vinegar and salt water and fumigate below with pans of burning pitch. However, this was obviously a fruitless gesture, of which we were all well aware, even the captain himself. A prodigious number of creatures had already infested the ship itself, and during the warm daylight hours they apparently retreated to the dank shadows and more remote parts of ship, being basically nocturnal in nature and hitherto accustomed to their twilight world beneath the sea. In several such places we uncovered to our growing horror sticky clusters of what could only be egg deposits, somewhat comparable to a frog's egg sacs. We destroyed those we were actually able to ferret out, or dared to try. Moreover, a quick, tentative inspection of the hold revealed a new crisis at hand. The thing's rapacious appetites had compelled those which remained attached to the hull to burrow themselves deeply into the scantling, weakening the structure in spots and causing the ship to slowly take on water. The crew grew increasingly morose and fretful, and after midday about half the men began milling together with renewed protests and murmuring. The crew of the Reaper was a diverse and rather motley collection. Most were in their late teens, some, as I, were in their 20s and 80s. Few, such as the old man, in their 30s. We represented numerous nationalities, including Spaniards, Swedes, Germans, Irishmen, Frenchmen, Italians, and a smattering of Pacific Islanders. And from every walk of life we were adventurous gentlemen, reckless soldiers, discontented tradesmen. Among us a failed Shakespearean actor, a homesick farm boy, a bankrupt Philadelphia hardware clerk, and even myself, a well-educated Kentuckian having given up on Miprofsion as a newspaper reporter in order to see the world. Presently the gathering ambled to the afterhouse, something most assuredly weighing on their minds, and converged toward the old man. The ship's helmsman, whom it was rumored was a British jailbird having escaped from a penal colony in Australia, stepped forward to address the captain. He was a brawny, bullying cock-o'-the-walk, but seemed to hold strong influence over some of the others. "We chaps wish to ave a word wi' you, captain," he announced stonily. The old man folded his arms and said nothing, waiting. The other continued, "We been studying this predicament, and seeing as we got no wind to make for land, think it would be best if we all evacuate the ship, leave to these miserable buggers." The old man paled at this, being more a challenge than appeal, and swallowed hard. "I forbid it. This ship is under my command, as well as her crew, and I say no. She won't be yours much longer." The surly helmsman sneered. "Between the sea and those critters, we can overcome them somehow. We must. We cannot carry these things with us to an inhabited port. You saw their eggs. They would multiply tenfold, continue to adapt, spawn, and spread to other vessels, become a plague. Nor can we surrender the ship to them, leaving both an uncertain fate. No, we must keep our wits about us, exterminate them, and bide for a favorable wind. She will not founder if we can make good her course and set to somewhere safe for repairs. Besides, consider your mates who have given their lives for the wealth in our hold. 'Twould be a crime, nay, a sin to forsake it. And pray tell, what bloody use is enelato those poor blighters, dead since eaten alive? Or to us about to join them?" Several others piped in with raucous voices. The captain spotted his second mate amongst them. "You too, man, yows, hide with these mischief makers." The second mate raised his already festering, bandaged stump. "Aye, Captain. I would gladly give myself over to the mercy of the drink afore I'd let those horrid devils touch me again. But we would be weeks at sea. The nearest coast is bounded by treacherous reefs and strong currents. Asterisk, 'tis a hostile and uncivilized region, arid mountain wilderness. No ship anchors there if they can prevent it. There would be uncounted privations. 'Twould be lunacy, plain and simple, and I shan't allow it." The old man managed to retain his outward composure and a frail facade of authority, but beneath his somewhat faltering speech, I detected that he could not avoid being swept up in the same undercurrent of dismay washing over most of the crew. Our good captain, once God Almighty off quarter deck, was quickly losing control off High's men. The group's leader gave him one last, long, ugly look, and absently fondling his sheath knife, I noticed, then turned and stormed off. Hereupon the others likewise dispersed, still grumbling. This aura of tense unrest lingered through the rest of the afternoon, escalating fatefully just before sunset, when the brooding silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream from the galley. With a prick of panic, we rushed to its source and found the cookie shrieking in agony, his eyes wide circles of fear. He was flailing his arms and clawing mindlessly at one off, creature's a very big one, which was feasting on the side of his face. For a second we were all agog, smitten by the horror of the spectacle, until the helmsman, whose chum he was, leapt forward to seize the fiendish creature with both hands, and with all his might wrenched it off of its victim. Tragically, in so doing, the thing took with it a third off Cook's face, exposing raw white bone. His eyes rolled up in the back of High's head, his face dripping gore and his mouth gaping open in shock. He fell to his knees, tottered a moment, then collapsed to hit the floor with a ghastly sound. He twitched once or twice and lay still. The monster had landed on its back a few feet away, and the enraged helmsman grabbed a meat cleaver and viciously hacked at the underside of the creature till it was quite dead. Just then we glimpsed another of the things darting off into the scraps of the shadows, suggesting a surprising mobility more akin to a crab or spider than a snail. Conversely, they also moved slowly and silently, almost as if stealthily stalking their prey, and could climb upon people or objects without at first being perceived, especially at night. During the whole of this disaster, the old man stood frozen in the background, drugged with the terror of it, saying and doing nothing. The contemptuous helmsman shot him another withering glare, and coldly brushed past him. That evening the captain doubled the watch, delegating two of his more faithful older hands, and gave them specific instructions to alert him straightaway if there were any signs offerable from the disgruntled crew members. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and things began to look bleak indeed. Of late we had come to expect the worst, and the following morning brought with it still more reason for our mounting consternation. We found that the two guards were assaulted sometime during wee hours before light, and the half-dozen men who constituted the preceding day's assemblage had furtively jumped ship. Apparent lithe, too, on duty, tried to enforce the old man's order, for one of them had been dealt a cruel blow from behind with a belaying pin, killing him instantly, intentional or no. The other was pretty bad off due to a dagger wound to the chest. The fellow nearly bled to death, and we had difficulty in keeping the bleeding at check. He was more unconscious than not, and his recovery seemed doubtful. The conspirators left further evidence off their departure, inasmuch as the two remaining whaleboats, in addition to the spare, had been quietly but thoroughly sabotaged. Whether this malicious act was perpetrated to spite the old man or to thwart later probable charges of mutiny and the gallows dance, I could not say for certain. Someone also discovered our stores of victuals and fresh water had been ransacked, as well as assorted and sundry articles pilfered from the supply lockers. I felt the captain had painted an accurate picture of the ultimate futility of abandoning ship in these waters, and had no doubt but that the scoundrels would all perish long before ever they could gain safety. Notwithstanding, such was of little consolation in view of our own plight. There was no practical means of combating these loathsome creatures, and they grew bolder day by day. Neither can we hope to mend one of the boats and ourselves escape if needs be, for the carpenter was among the recent victims, and obviously would have been unable to salvage the boat anyway. As if in further mockery, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a light but freshening westerly found us, after almost 4 days flat calm. But of course no, we were even more Siri Ausländer being, just sea of us left, and hardly enough to operate the ship efficiently for any prolonged period of time. I took it upon myself to hoist aloft the appropriate distress flags. We ate a meager meal at sunset, and by headed each to our quarters, 3 off, hands to the forecastle, the old man to his cabin, and I to the former first mate's cabin, which I had recently occupied at the captain's permission. I was about to retire for evening when I heard a muffled, broken moaning from the lazaret, where we had situated the injured man. Procuring a taper, I proceeded to investigate. When I peered inside, my stomach turned to ice, for the poor fellow was on the floor, virtually covered with the creatures all sizes as they fell to devouring him alive, moving hungrily about like so many maggots. Inevitably they were lured by the scent of his blood, and now it was too late. Powerless to avail him, I spun and fled, shamefully relieved we had isolated him from the rest office and shut off that particular section off the vessel. Then I related my grisly discovery to the captain. He made no reply, only sat staring at me blankly, eyes like drab marbles, his face drawn, haggard, and ashen. He looked as if had aged 50 years. I left him to his dark imaginings and hurried to my own room, where I eventually managed to obtain a few hours off at full, troubled sleep. After the sun was well up the next day, I ventured back to the scene of the previous night's horror, and found the man's fresh white skeleton, picked quite clean. Upon finishing their ghoulish feast, the creatures had, fortunately, vanished elsewhere. I disposed of the grim remains over the side, then came to realize with a shudder that I was the only one up and about. I went below, forward to the forecastle, where the other 3 hands were quartered. It was dark and musty, as most off. Hatches leading up to the light and fresh air were battened down. I approached the doorway cautiously, and with a heightening sense of apprehension resolved not to enter the compartment, but merely called out loudly to my mates. There was no answer from within save for a telltale scurrying noise. I backed away, noticing for the first time on the floor at my feet the multitudes of slug-like tracks and slimy trails of bloody mucus extending off in all directions. With skin suddenly a-crawl, I retreated quickly and returned aft, bringing myself up to the old man's cabin door. Knocking repeatedly, calling to him in a tone of growing alarm, he finally responded. He sounded distracted, distant, and hoarse, betraying a note of terrified resignation beyond despair. "Go away," he croaked. "Leave me be." "But sir," said I, "you did not answer, and the others." "I am fine," he snapped, his voice rising to an anger tremor. "Begone with you." Confused and concerned, I withdrew to my cabin for the remainder of the day, feeling increasingly helpless, a chilling and forlorn weight upon my shoulders. Then, at about dusk, I was startled by the loud report of a pistol from the old man's stateroom, and frantically bolted through the main cabin into his sleeping quarters. My shock was complete when I found him on his berth, having just put a ball off-lead through his brain. Blood was everywhere, and almost at once I detected a movement to my right, turning so to encounter not one but several of the creatures scuttling swiftly through his cabin toward where the dead man lay. Fully fearing now for my own life, I fled to my cabin and thought quickly. Doubtless these demons would soon be upon me as well, lest I acted shrewdly and with haste. This room had no door, but rather a makeshift curtain that could be drawn. With desperation born of fear, I struck on the idea off, bring loose my bunk, and positioned its frame and pallet upright across the doorway. It was a thin and relatively flimsy obstacle, though I pushed a heavy seat, chest against it, for additional eye support. Wiping my brow off, perspiration there, like warm rivulets off here, became painfully cognizant of how cramped and inadequate my refuge was, and somehow cold as a crypt. The night slowly ebbed away, merciless in its eternity. I am the lone survivor of an entire crew of able-bodied men, and a hideous death creeps on the other side of my temporary barricade. In these long, darkling hours I have screwed up my courage and set to pondering as objectively as possible my dire state of affairs, ever mindful of fearsome skittering and chewing sounds issuing from immediately outside my cabin. We have inadvertently brought these accursed creatures up from the bottom of the sea, and there appears to be no alternative but to send them back whence they came. Miplin is simply perilous. If at dawn's first light I can dash across the galley and the length off steerage, and can hurl a well-aimed burning oil lamp into the blubber room. The greasy try-works will ignite instantly and bum fiercely, the conflagration hopefully consuming everything on her before she goes down, and, saints willing, can escape speedily up through the main hatch and take some substantial jetsam overboard with me onto which I can cling. Our first mate kept the ship's log, and since his death the old man had assigned me to keep the daily entries, my being learned off books. I have been previously too preoccupied by the calamity of the past few days to do so, but now bring everything to date and leave this journal as both witness and warning in the event something goes awry. I pray no one ever need find this, that I am successful in my mission and the Reaper is consigned to hereditary grave. Alas, I feel the time has come. I go now to do what must be done. In his gloomy cabin aboard Jezebel, Captain Seabury finished reading this last line of script and slowly closed the log. Morbid recollections of the pitiful skeleton at the foot of the steerage companionway, with the shattered oil lamp beneath it, flickered ominously in the dark recesses of his mind, and now he comprehended with dawning horror the full implications of the strange account he had just read. Night had almost slipped by like a thief unnoticed. In less than 2 hours it would be daybreak, the men preparing to transfer the oil from the Reaper. He was but a fool, damn the oil. Orders must be given immediate. Litto torch the nightmare ship and cast loose before it was too late. All at once he heard a terrified scream from somewhere on board his own ship, touching every inch off his body with fear. This was promptly followed by another, and then he cleared the paralyzing fog in his head long enough to realize that this second came from his own throat. Indeed, for something large, wet, and cold was slowly crawling up his leg.